We're all set?
Yeah, I just give 1 minute, see if. No, it does not look like there's any members of the public.
Oh, okay, great. All right, well, I'm going to call the Ad hoc Sustainability and Resilience Committee of the Common Council to order. It's May 17th. It's 5:31. This is a special meeting date. We did change it with the appropriate notice because we had this special guest, John Trzynski, that we wanted to have join us. The committee members that I see present are Mr. Livingston, Barbara Smith, Josh Goldstein, and joining us this evening is Council President Greg Burnett. If we see other people, Katie, you'll just note it in the minutes as it happens. And the first thing we're going to do is actually approve the minutes of April 12th. So would I have a motion for the approval of the April 12th minutes as filed?
Lisa, I'm sorry, somebody did join from the public as you were
Oh,
talking.
okay. All right, I guess I'll finish the approval of the minutes and then we'll go to public participation now that we know that there might be somebody there. So we have a motion on the floor to approve the minutes of April 12th, 2023. All in favor, please raise their hands. That's 4. We have a quorum and that is it. So those have been passed. So let's reopen public participation because there was no one there before. If anybody from the public would like to speak, we can hear them now. They should raise their hand, I guess, if they'd like to be heard.
Miss Linnell Jones would like to speak.
Great. Okay, so she has 3 minutes. Ms. Jones.
Thank
Ms.
you.
Jo-
Good evening. This is Linnell Jones. First, I want to thank you, John, for everything on Circa's website, and I look forward to your presentation today. In April, this committee welcomed Louise Washer, President of the Norwalk River Watershed Association, and Dick Harris, both members of the Mayor's Ad hoc Committee for Water Quality. Louise and Dick shared the committee's history and 17 recommendations, all included in your agenda, going into depth about recommendation number 1, PFAS and PFAS. The minutes you will approve this evening include my recommendation and my question about recommendation number 3, which has never been answered. Number 3 reads, encourage and support DEEP's establishment of a new general permit or other appropriate means for regulating the discharge of stormwater from non-municipal separate storm sewer systems constructed on all roads and low areas into Norwalk waters. This recommendation implies there is no current regulation for stormwater discharge on roads or low areas close to Norwalk's waters unless it is a city street. According to Circa's website and the Connecticut DEEP website, both point source and non-point source stormwater runoff is currently regulated on public and private property. So I wonder if this particular recommendation is more of the city of Norwalk's ongoing gaslighting that Wilson Point, a private association with private roads, required no permits for filling tidal and inland wetlands, adding hundreds of feet of new drainage from fertilized lawns and roads, new storm drains, and new outflows into Long Island Sound. No plans were ever shared. No one, including the Harbor Commission, city agencies, and DEEP, ever reviewed anything, and there is not written approval. No plans are stamped, no permit required. If I ask our guest speaker, who I know is here to present his work, if he believes Connecticut DEEP needs to establish a new general permit to regulate non-municipal drainage, I know he will give the same answer everyone from Circa has given me, that he has given me on the phone. It is very clear on Circa's website, a website packed with relevant information. No, a new permit is not needed. Municipalities need to understand regulations in coastal flood zones and enforce them. Even if the landowner, the one responsible for getting proper permits, is able to gain special access to our mayor's office. Gaslighting by saying private associations like Wilson Point do not require plans, review, or permits is just gaslighting. Again, thank you, John, for everything on the Circa website and for your presentation today. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you, Ms. Jones. Is there anybody else, Katie, who's joined public participation?
No, there isn't. Nope.
So we will close public participation. We need to remove Linnell Jones as a panelist at this time. And then what we can do is begin John Trzynski's presentation. So this is a presentation of Resilient South Norwalk, given by the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation, which is otherwise known as CIRCA. So John, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for coming this evening. We really appreciate the late night hours.
Yeah, no problem at all. Just give me 1 second here and I will. Okay, so thank you for having me tonight to do this presentation. So I'm here to provide an update to the committee about this project that CIRCA has been doing in partnership with the city. We call it Resilient South Norwalk. This, as a reminder, this is one of 7 projects that CIRCA is working on through what we call phase 3 of Resilient Connecticut. And Resilient Connecticut was a program that was looking at climate vulnerabilities across Fairfield and New Haven counties, and it has since expanded to other counties in the state. So this project is one of kind of the first 7 projects that we're taking on through this work. The team that's working on this includes folks from CIRCA, as well as our sub-consultant, which is AECOM. So AECOM brings the engineering and the landscape architecture and some of the other expertise to help us do the analysis and look at solutions for some of the climate vulnerabilities that we see in South Norwalk. So taking a step back, I wanted to just kind of remind everyone that one of the big things that we were focused on in doing the study in South Norwalk was this idea of the corridors, and specifically something that we call these resilient corridors. So thinking about which of these key transportation connections are likely to experience different types of flood impacts in the future, and what are the potential options to adapt these corridors over time to make them more resilient to climate change. And so that's a big focus of what we're doing, in addition to some other things that I'll get into. And this map just shows a little bit of the AECOM team and doing the analysis. They're sort of looking at the northern part of what they call the study region and the southern part. And they have some different characteristics in terms of the land uses and some of the conditions of the roads, and that'll help to shape some of the options for what we come up with. So as a reminder, the project we've gotten through the first couple of milestones of the project. The first part of the project was about just mapping out the existing and the future conditions to climate change. And this map here is one that the team put together, and it's showing the extent of the floodplain in the future under what we call like a 1% annual chance storm, with the addition of 20 inches of sea level rise added to it. And where does the 20 inches of sea level rise come from? That is the current guidance under Public Act 1882, is for municipalities to consider 20 inches of sea level rise by 2050. And that is the upper bound of the likely range of what we expect in terms of sea level change out to the mid-century. And part of what's challenging is, this is the team is sort of getting at all the different flood pathways, all of the different ways in which coastal storm surge enters into the area. So it's not just about sort of blocking or cutting off the water in one location. There's multiple pathways in which a coastal storm surge will enter into, both the northern and the southern part of the study area. So we're trying to get at that with the first part of this and looking at the future conditions for coastal flooding. So this is kind of the next step of the project, is about evaluating the set of what we call these adaptation options. So basically, what can we do? What solutions can we recommend and come up with to address both the flooding aspects of this and then also the increase in temperature? Part of another reason why South Norwalk was an area that we felt we need to prioritize was because you see this combination of vulnerability to heat and vulnerability to flooding. So this is the AECOM team starting to put together what they call the kit of parts or the toolkit of potential adaptation options that the city can pursue, and starting to get those into a sort of a summary format for the public and for the city's staff and leadership. So the first thing that we've looked at is about the stormwater modeling. And we have some schematics of the drainage structures and some of the pipe capacity and the network of stormwater pipes that we've gotten from the city. So we have at least some understanding of where there are some of the pipes that just have limited capacity, where we have larger pipes that are feeding into smaller pipes, and could be causing some stormwater flooding as a result of that. And then we have some areas where we've identified that there are outfalls that are maybe during a higher than normal high tide or a storm surge, they may be backflowing water in through the drainage structures into the street. So that's kind of the low hanging fruit that the city can look at, adjusting the pipes with a backflow prevention, or looking at ways to just sort of make sure that the storm surge is not backflowing water into the street. And then the other aspect of doing kind of a more in-depth stormwater model is that you really need to go out and do like a survey of, doing precise measurements of all the inverts and pipe sizes and all of that to really kind of get a more high resolution picture of where the capacity is just sort of insufficient for the amount of rain that we currently get and that we're going to get in the future. So the first couple of things is related to that stormwater. The third thing is about green infrastructure. So this is just a way of trying to retain more of the stormwater. I'm sure most of you are familiar with kind of the concept of the green infrastructure. So the team is sort of prioritizing this set of roads here for some sort of green infrastructure, retention, detention types of strategies, and that can help to both improve some of the road flooding, and it also has a water quality benefit. So definitely green infrastructure has got to be a part of the toolkit in this area. And if you're looking for kind of an example where a city is kind of taking this approach, you can look at New Haven, where they've done a lot of kind of these distributed green infrastructure around downtown. And then they have projects to sort of increase the capacity of the pipes that are conveying the stormwater. And then this fourth aspect is about kind of one of the key questions that we wanted to answer with this project. And I guess to put it as simply as possible is just sort of under future conditions, which of the roads are going to flood under a range of different scenarios, and how high would the city need to elevate those roads in order to maintain dry access and egress across these roads under a range of different scenarios. So basically what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at, which of the roads are going to flood, and how high would we need to elevate them to prevent them from flooding under these different scenarios. So the next couple of slides are kind of focused on that aspect of where we are in the study. And again, I said that we are looking at this range of scenarios, and probably the simplest way to put this, and it gets confusing with all the numbers, but all of these numbers are expressed in what's called NAVD 88. So this is the tidal datum. So this is basically kind of the current expression of sea level. So the 0.0 for sea level. And so when we look at different storm surges and the level of how high you would need to elevate the road over the expected storm surge, we look at these in NAVD 88 to sort of understand it. So this is looking at when we see an elevation of a storm surge at 8 feet. And that is 8 feet according to NAVD 88. So it's important to understand that the current mean higher high water, so the current high tide is around 3.5 feet. So, under the current conditions, 3.5 feet is about our high tides. So an 8-foot NAVD 88 is about a storm surge currently of about like 4 to 4.5 feet. So this is a major flood today. But in the future, when we add 20 inches, right, then it only takes about a 2 to 3 foot storm surge to get to this level. So, and if you want to think about a recent example, the storm that we had back in December was about a 3-foot storm surge, right? And we calculate that storm back in December 23rd, I believe it was, that for most of the coastline was about a 10-year event. So the type of thing that we currently get about once every 10 years. So this is going to be a more frequent type of flood condition that South Norwalk's going to experience. So when we get that type of a flood under future conditions, these areas that are outlined here in purple, those lines, those are the roads that would flood. And we would, sorry, I need to move my zoom box around here. So we would need to elevate those roads to elevation 9 in order to keep them dry under the future conditions. And what that doesn't tell you, it doesn't tell you the current elevation of the road, right? Because these roads are not at elevation 0. All right, I see we have a hand, and I know this gets complicated, so why don't we just stop, and if there's questions, we can just get into it. Darlene, did you want to ask a question?
Darlene, I think you're muted.
I raised my hand. I just wanted to ask questions as you go along, or if you wanted to, if we were going to leave until you finish. I wasn't sure how that was going to work. We can ask questions now.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
you can hear me?
I'm happy to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
your
just having
audio-
a little trouble hearing you, Darlene. I
Yeah.
don't know why your microphone's funny.
All day with the speaker at work.
If you're having trouble, if we have trouble listening to you, we could have you type it and we could read it for you.
No, great.
Darlene, the other thing is if you turn off your video, sometimes that improves the audio.
All right.
While she's doing that, can you explain this NAVD 88 again? I mean, what you just said.
Sure. Yeah, so when we talk about sea level and we talk about actually the elevation of anything, right, we need to have a benchmark of something that we're comparing the elevation to. And that when we talk about sea level, the current measurement of sea level is expressed in this, what we call this tidal datum, NAVD 88. And it's something that, is, I forget which department in the federal government does the work to do this, but they basically, they measure over a 20-year period, and they try to screen out all the different like fluctuations of like El Nino and this and that. And then they come up with a datum, which is like, okay, here's where sea level is right now. So this is the current sea level, essentially, is to put it simply.
Okay.
Now, the roads in South Norwalk, the ones that flood, the ones that are low lying, are at about elevation 7. So typically what you see, and this is pretty common across a lot of coastal towns in Connecticut, is that there are low-lying roads that flood. They're all at around elevation 7. And I don't know why, there's probably a historical reason why the roads were built to that elevation. But so if we say, okay, our mean higher high water is at 3.5 feet, and then our roads are at elevation 7, you can see that, we don't need that much of an elevation change in order to get the road to flood. In some cases, there are actually some intersections of Water Street where we're at elevation 5. So that's only about 1.5 foot difference between our high tides and the elevation of the road. So why does Water Street flood? Part of the reason why Water Street floods is because it's so low. you know, in relation
Actually,
to.
I'm going to stop you there. So you were talking about if the NABD 88 's sort of the baseline for where the water level, why would, and Water Street say it's at 7, why did you start at 3.5 there?
Well, because sea level, the way they calculate the datum, they are trying to find sort of the midpoint between high tide and low tide, right? Because there's this fluctuation.
So, okay, so that's okay. So that explains. So high
Yeah, so
tide
the-
is the 3.5.
Exactly. And high
Gotcha.
tide, what they talk about it in terms of mean higher high water. So what does that mean? It means throughout the course of the year, the high tide actually fluctuates. You know, sometimes you get higher tides than normal because
Right,
of
right.
the full moon. You know, so the highest of the high tides is mean higher high water. So when we think about a storm surge, the storm surge is basically the extra water level above the high tide that we
Right.
get when we get like a coastal storm.
Got it. All right, thank you.
Then just to like dig in one more thing, and then we'll see if Darlene's ready to go. So I had that question about the 1% annual storm. So you've actually baked into this number that in 2050, when we think that we're going to have 20 inches of sea level rise, we also think that the 1% annual storm will have a higher surge than it is currently now. So now it's at 938, and then we expect it to be 1.5 feet higher. Do I understand
Exactly.
that right? Okay, so
Yep,
good.
that's
I think
correct.
I understand it. Darlene, are you able to chat with us now, or did she go out to come back in? Maybe she just did that. It looks like Darlene went out to come back in. All right, we'll go, keep going. And once Darlene's back in, maybe we can get her question in.
Sure. All right, so this is the next scenario, right, that we're looking at, and that's when that is when we get to elevation 9 in terms of NAVD 88. And that's you know, currently that's about a 5.5 foot storm surge. That's a big storm, like a Superstorm Sandy type of a storm. Or at least like a major flood, like a tropical storm or something like that. So in the future, in order to keep the roads that flood dry under those types of conditions, we would need to elevate those roads to elevation 10. So again, if we're thinking that a lot of the existing roads that flood are around elevation 7 now, we would need to bring them up to 10. That means we'd have to elevate the roads 3 feet in order to get over the future storm surge. And I know, again, this gets complicated, so I'm happy to go through it again if we need to. And then the last one is looking at the future 1% annual chance storm. So this is kind of like the future Superstorm Sandy with 20 inches of sea level rise added to it. The roads that are outlined in red, these are the roads that are going to flood under that type of condition. We would need to elevate to elevation 11 in order to maintain dry access along these roads. So again, we think the road is currently at 7. We need to get it to 11. We need to elevate the road 4 feet in order to maintain dry access for these roads that are in red here.
Do you have any idea about how expensive that is? Do we have?
I do not. I do not.
Or more fundamentally, how do you elevate a road?
Well, it can be done. And has been done. And actually, I think one of the questions that the city needs to think through is that which roads do you want to elevate? Which roads are a priority to elevate? Do we want to elevate all of the roads that flood? Or do we want to pick one corridor, right? One set of roads that we're going to elevate to this new kind of datum and make sure that that is our kind of resilient corridor through South Norwalk. And then maybe we are going to elevate one of the other roads not quite as high. Maybe we don't elevate some of the roads. So these are all questions that are not necessarily technical questions. They're sort of like, what is the future of the city and this part of the city, and how do you want to kind of manage the flood risk with regard to the roads? So just kind of quickly, I'll go back to the question about how do you do it and all of that. But just quickly, what the AECOM team, what they've got here is they're just sort of picking some spots, some intersections to compare. And so the circle, the yellow circle, right? This is basically the intersection of Concord and Water Street. And this is just kind of show with a little bit of a schematic to sort of you get a sense of how deep the current flood is. And this is, again, this is kind of the 1% annual chance flood currently, and then in the future. So currently, the depth of flooding is about up to, your waist. The future flood would be up to your chest. And that's because, the road is at elevation 7 now. And that's the case for both that intersection of Concord and Water, as well as Concord and Day. So those are both at elevation 7 currently. Now, what's interesting here is that the redevelopment that happened, I think this was from Soundview Landing, but there was also the redevelopment of the park at the corner of Raymond and Day. So as part of that redevelopment, they already,
Ryan Park, yeah.
yeah, John Ryan Park. So they already elevated that intersection. So you already have that intersection was brought up to 12.5 feet as part of that redevelopment. So that's already above the future 1% annual chance storm with 20 inches of sea level rise. Now you compare that to the intersection of Raymond and Water, and that's one of those spots where the road is actually at elevation 5. So in order to bring that part of Water Street up above the 1% annual chance storm, you'd have to add, a lot of elevation to that. So that's going to be tricky. And, again, we can get into sort of like what makes that complicated as we go along here, but I just want to kind of get through the rest of my slides. And so this is kind of comparing, like, so if you decided that, okay, Day Street is the corridor that we're going to sort of prioritize for elevation, you've already got that intersection with Raymond and Day, which is already high, and then it sort of slopes down as you go south. And so you'd have to think about elevating that stretch. I think the interesting thing that the team sort of identified is that you just have less buildings and less property along that stretch that you would have to sort of deal with the connections and the driveways and all of that. So that's part of what you might want to like weigh here, is that if you elevate Water Street, how high you elevate it is complicated by how many different connections you need to make with the new elevation of the road. And that's sort of what the AECOM team is like trying to think through here and show. So quickly moving to the southern part of the study area. So the flood pathways here are a little bit different. You've got Village Creek, which is obviously a tidal wetland, and so flooding does come through there. And then you've also got the shoreline by Harbor Shores. And so this is kind of similar, looking at the stormwater system, in the same sort of approach. You need to like get really high resolution measurements of all the pipes. There are both Meadow Street and Woodward that could be, you could look at green infrastructure there. It's somewhat challenging because I know like there's not a lot of road to work with at least on Meadow Street. That northern part of Meadow Street is very dense. But it is a stretch where you could try to think about green infrastructure. The team also looked at, the edges of Village Creek. They proposed this idea of like flood berms or something like that. I'm personally a little skeptical about that because you're not going to be able to put sort of flood berms directly up against the tidal wetlands there. So the thing to think about there would be the commercial industrial properties, sort of those sites. How those evolve in the future is kind of a key question. Any way in which you can improve the setbacks on those sites, improve some of the room to work with, would potentially allow you to take an approach where you put some kind of flood protection on the tidal wetlands side of those commercial properties. On the properties themselves, you might have some room to work with in terms of like flood protection. And then there's this particular stretch of, I believe it's Woodward, where the road is actually pretty wide in this stretch. And so the team has started to look at this one particular stretch, kind of the same set of scenarios, looking at the different scenarios and looking at how high you would need to elevate. It's a similar elevation. I think a lot of that stretch of Woodward is at elevation 7. So you need to bring it up 4 feet in order to keep it dry under a 1% annual chance storm in the future. But what I think the team is sort of interested in is that this one stretch, you actually have a pretty wide road. And I believe there's a pretty large right of way on the side of the commercial industrial properties. And so that might be a place where the city could think about realigning the road a little bit, and then elevating the road closer to those properties. Part of the challenge would be all of the residential streets to the east of that would need to connect up to a new elevated road. And so that's what the team has kind of started to think through there, and thinking about what you could do. And you can actually potentially keep the existing road and then have it as kind of like a local road that connects up to the higher road. There's a bunch of different things you could do in terms of green infrastructure and sort of integrating green infrastructure with some kind of stormwater detention, retention. You could also create a greenway with bike paths and think about trees and things like that. So it's an area where there might be potentially room to work with in terms of improving the flood resiliency along this stretch.
Yeah, one thing we talked about, John, at the last meeting, I don't know if you were on it, was the problem with Woodward is that there's a lot of trees that have been taken down. So we have all these huge stumps. And so tree addition is going to be hard.
Yes, right. And it's more like if there was a kind of a realignment or a reconstruction of the road, then it might give you the room to sort of work with in dealing with that issue. So again, our project isn't just about flooding. And so the team is also looking at a lot of the heat aspects. So how can you maximize the heat mitigation? There's a whole bunch of different things that you can do. Looking at pocket parks and things like that, street trees. You can look at the cooling centers and the community centers in different parts of the city. So there's a whole bunch of stuff related to heat that I think the team is still kind of fleshing that out a little bit. But it's also something that we're definitely looking at. The last thing that is interesting and has come up in discussions is this idea of potentially a resiliency overlay. So I know the city's been going through the rezoning and thinking about rezoning. So you could create basically an overlay zone. And what are some of the types of things you could put into a resiliency overlay? There are some cities that are starting to do this, and we are looking around at other cities around the country for examples of resiliency overlays in specific neighborhoods. So there's one in Norfolk, Virginia, where they have like a really bad flooding problem. So there's different examples out there that we're looking at. So, but essentially, if as there is redevelopment or as development is changing, properties are changing, you could try to think about how the properties would connect up to higher elevation roads. You could think about the stormwater specifications of the sites, and you could really, in certain parts of South Norwalk, you might want to make the stormwater regulations just a little more stringent because of the flood concerns. You can think about sort of the different aspects of sort of maximizing the flood resiliency of the sites through an overlay. And that might be not as much of a big project, but it might have a longer term impact, especially if the city is like doing a lot of redevelopment. And so that's something, go ahead.
Can you talk more about that? Like, so I think Darlene was interested in this as I am. So do you have specific language for zoning overlays that we can share with our P and Z group? And can we require that, some of these roads be lifted and things like that by developers? I mean, how much will the developers take on in a situation like this, in your experience?
Yeah, well, I think it's still a pretty new thing in Connecticut, so I don't want to, so I think our experience is limited. So just to be frank, but what we are doing, like I said, is we're looking around at other places that are dealing with a lot of the same issues, and trying to look at the language that they're including in there and seeing what's relevant, what might be relevant. I think what I could say for this at this point is that if this is something that the city wants us to sort of focus on, we can focus on basically developing the recommendations and look at the language and then give that to you as kind of like a deliverable as part of this project. And then you can decide what you want to do with that.
So you mentioned that you might have different deliverables, at this point, like you want to get some direction about where to go. So one deliverable is, hey, do you want us to develop these zoning overlays? Can you suggest some of the other directions you might want to go in?
Yeah, so I think we had the budget, and I think what our goal with this project initially was, we wanted to pick 2 or 3 areas and develop 2 or 3 specific projects. And what I mean by developing is, getting them up to like a concept level design, and getting benefit cost analysis. So doing some benefit cost analysis, basically giving you the materials that you could go get, like a FEMA brick grant, or there's another grant that's interesting that the DOT, the federal DOT has. It's called I believe the Protect grant program, and that's where they have quite a bit of money, billions of dollars essentially. I think that one is like almost $1 billion that the federal DOT has for climate resilience related to transportation. And so you could think about maybe partnering with the WestCog, or maybe just developing a bit of a partnership to go after one of those grants to look at. And they'll fund studies, they'll fund planning, they'll fund design. But anyways, going back to what we could provide, we can pick 2 or 3 of these specific locations and give you kind of the materials to go after some specific grants, in addition to giving you kind of the suite of options that you can pick from going forward. And then one of the additional deliverables could be kind of the overlay. Here's the recommendations. Here's some example language that you could pull from. So I think that's where we need to start thinking about where we should focus. And I think we're thinking that we have a public workshop that we have to do as a next step. So I think we're thinking a public workshop in mid-June to mid-July timeframe. And I think we're thinking about an in-person workshop, and basically laying out a lot of the different options and getting feedback on that. So there's a bunch of different ways that we could get the feedback, but we kind of need to get some direction as to where we should go.
Okay, so I'm communicating with our friend Darlene because she has trouble with her audio. One of the priorities for her would be the Widow Meadow Street. And I think maybe Mr. Livingston can speak to that too, because we're building a new school at the end of Meadow Street. So this is going to be a really important corridor for children to go to and from schools and things like that. So I think, and I don't know if anybody else in the committee has a thought with regard to that as being an important focal area in this area as well. Committee, any thoughts?
Well, just on that point, I know Alan Lowe is looking at securing additional funding to work on the flooding down in that area. But yes, it is something that needs to be looked at. Lisa, I know this is beyond the scope, but I mean, this makes me wonder more and more about Rowayton. I mean, we're looking at all these neighborhoods, but makes me wonder about, you know, if we can look at Rowayton at all. I guess it's, as I said, beyond the scope of this, but these
No,
neighborhoods, if these neighborhoods having a problem, you know, Rowayton is too.
And Wilson Point, and
Yeah.
when you look at these flooding maps and you look at Harborview, it feels like it's all green, and Shorefront
Yeah.
Park, it's very worrisome. And these 1% storms, like the 1% storms we suffer now, are going to be much smaller and different than the 1% storms we'll suffer as each decade goes by, right, John? I mean, that's pretty much the takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the prediction is that kind of the major flooding that we get now, which is that 4.5 to 5 foot storm surge that we were talking about earlier. You know, we get those like every 20 to 25 years. When we look back at the last 100 years, those are kind of the big floods. But when we add sea level to Long Island Sound, it doesn't take the big storms to produce that same water level. So that's the problem. So those types of floods are going to happen more frequently. So it's kind of thinking that, you know, places that used to flood every 20 years are going to start flooding every 5 years. And so the places that flood are not going to change that much. And that's just has to do with the topography, you know. So like the low-lying parts of South Norwalk are, there's such a dramatic change in elevation because of those hills and ridges. So it's really the same places that have experienced flooding. I think the main thing is that whatever exists there, whatever goes there, whatever development happens there is going to have to be able to withstand that frequency of flooding. And so that's just something that, you know, the city's got to think through, and, you know, figure out how to redesign, adapt those sites to accommodate that increase in the frequency. And, you know, what are we talking about? We're not talking about 20 feet of water. We're talking about, you know, generally the low-lying spots, like I said, the low-lying spots range from elevation 5 to 6 to 7. So you're talking about 4 to 5 to 6 feet of water, which is a lot, you know. I mean, that's, you know, when there's a storm surge and there's 6 feet of water in the street, that's a dangerous situation, you know. So, so yeah, I'm rambling a bit, but I think it's not a hopeless situation, but it is something that the city's going to have to sort of adapt to.
Hey, John, what did you say the December 23rd flood was? What elevate and how high?
So that was about a 3 foot storm surge, right? So if we're at our mean high water is about 3.5 feet. So it was around 6 to 6.5.
Okay.
Right. So you probably saw, I'm guessing based on that, just off the top of my head, that there were those low spots along Water Street were probably flooded in December. Like the spots. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's your typical, in the future, that's going to be like your typical condition. Like you're going to have that, like, you know, semi-annual type of condition in the future with the addition of sea level. So
are there going to be new standards that FEMA gives us for how high buildings should be and things like that? Like, should we be building that into our planning and zoning? You know, right now we're supposed to be at 14 feet, I think. And should we just jump ahead to 19, or, you know, what are some of the things that you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think your flood ordinance already has some freeboard built into it, if I'm not mistaken. So I think you probably already have like a foot or 2 feet of freeboard that's a requirement for new development above the FEMA BFE. So I think the site development, the elevation of your sites you're probably on the right track in terms of, like, if you're doing development in a flood zone, you know, well, so just beyond sort of the larger question about it, the lower floor being sort of accommodating, so it's parking, you know, you're providing openings for the flood to pass through. That's important for site scale. So there's a lot of things you can do site scale to make the buildings resilient to that future flooding. But it doesn't do any good if you can't get to the buildings or if emergency vehicles cannot access the development because the road is flooded. So that's, I think, why you need to kind of look at both things. You can do requirements for site scale development, and I think you probably have pretty good requirements currently. Although that's also something we could look at with the overlay. We can take a look at that and review it and give you a recommendation one way or the other. But you also need to think about the public infrastructure that supports that development. You need to think about the roads, the emergency services that the city has to provide to that development, and that's connected to the roads. So those are all things that have to be part of the calculation, I think.
Also, for your zoning overlay, one of the thoughts I had was like, you talked a lot about the green infrastructure, and when we're talking to builders and developers and things like that, would that be included in your zoning overlay about, management of rain gardens or things? Can you talk a little bit about that? I think some of us don't know as much about that as we'd like.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different terminology that's out there. Some people use the term low impact development, so you might hear that. And it's essentially, you just want to make sure that as development is happening, that you're not increasing the impervious area. You're requiring that the development is going to be responsible for managing that stormwater. You don't want to increase. You don't want a new development to sort of increase the problem in terms of the stormwater system. So you want the developers to be the ones to have to take responsibility for that. And you do that by requiring that they manage the stormwater on site. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that they can do it. But I think the idea is that they're disconnecting the impervious surface. They're making sure that there's a lot of ways in which the stormwater can be retained and either recharge into the ground, or that it's at least retained until it can be discharged into the stormwater system. And that's a pretty mature space where there's a lot of pretty advanced standards that are out there, best management practices and things like that. So I think that's kind of more like low-hanging fruit that the city should really make sure. And I know that the idea of a stormwater authority has been a topic as well. And I don't know how contentious it is or not, but that is, I think, philosophically the idea is that the contributors to the stormwater issue they're sort of getting a free ride currently, and that the city has to spend public money and invest in public infrastructure to manage the stormwater. You want those folks to be contributing to the benefits of that, and I think that's the idea of the stormwater authority, which is it's a more contentious issue in Connecticut than it is in other states. There are other places that are doing it, and it's working quite well for that reason.
I don't want to say
Can you hear
stormwater
me?
too often because I just love stormwater authority. So I've been advocating
Can
for
you
it.
hear me?
Now we can hear you. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry. So I just have a question. I know about a year or so ago, I can't recall the organization that came down. I think they did a study of the actual coastal, the water line on the other side of Water Street, right? Where other property is on the water, of actually, I wouldn't say get rid of those businesses, but building out, I don't know what the terminology is, so forgive me, I'm very uneducated in this area, but building protective or grassy area that will stop the water from coming in. I don't know what you call that, but that's what I attended a meeting where were you at that, Katie, or anybody? I think Sabrina led that meeting. Lisa, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So where are we with that? Is that in this at all as a possibility?
You might
for
have missed
those-
it at the very beginning, Darlene, where John talked about green infrastructure. Do you want to go back to that slide, John, maybe to show Darlene?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the places where we are, I think, initially recommending green infrastructure is kind of like in the upland part of South Norwalk. So as you go up the hill from Water Street, so on Day Street, on I believe it was at South Main Street. So those are places where when there's a lot of rain, the water is traveling down the hill and it's going into the stormwater system, and all the water is sort of like traveling down towards the sound. So that's an area where you could try to soak up more of the rain through this kind of green infrastructure. And that can help to reduce the pressure on the stormwater system to kind of manage all of that flow of water. As far as along the water side of Water Street, if that's sort of the area are you referring to?
Yes, yes.
Marina side. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think there are green infrastructure approaches that would be good there because of the same reason, right? All of the water is flowing down the hill and it's all going onto the marina sites. And whatever is on those marina sites is getting soaked up in that water and it's going into the Long Island Sound. So again, thinking about if there are changes to property or redevelopment or any of those type of discussions, it would be very good to think about. You want to try to retain more of that water before it's sort of discharging into the Sound. And you can do that through green infrastructure. As far as like stopping the storm surge from Long Island Sound, there's not really good green infrastructure techniques that would do that. Essentially, if you were to just try to block the water from coming in from Long Island Sound, you'd be talking about a seawall. So you'd be talking about putting up a 6-7 foot high seawall along parts of those marina properties and sites. And I can't imagine that would be popular with anybody.
Yeah, and I'll say that what was provided as options was more like a walkway, a path that people could walk through with greenery, that sort of thing. It wasn't a wall, but it was more of a setting that people could use it, but it was also to help mitigate the water. And it was only presented, I think, once or twice, and I don't know, it actually went nowhere, but the idea was pretty interesting, but that was a few years ago.
Yeah, I think I brought up something like this actually in the last advisory meeting for this project. Okay. And that it's there are some examples where there are old sort of functioning marina districts. And so the difference in Norwalk is that you have a functioning commercial marina district, and there's people that don't want to see those changed from like commercial fishing and things like that. So but an example I think I brought up in the meeting was in Brooklyn, right? So Brooklyn Bridge Park was an area of the city. It was an old like marina district that was basically abandoned, and there was a bunch of brownfields. And but what they did is they redesigned the whole park with all this landscaping, and they built kind of like flood protection berms into it. And then they opened up like kind of a public space for public access on the water, kind of reconnected the community to the water. And it was kind of a big deal, like a pretty successful example of a redevelopment of a waterfront that incorporated kind of the flood protection to it. But again, that is something that I think the marina owners are probably not supporting, kind of like changing the whole approach. So that's just the discussion about like what does the community want for that area, and what do we want to maintain.
So thank you for that. So I'm glad you went back to this too. So the green area is where you say we can incorporate green infrastructure.
Yeah, that's correct.
My concern would be that we're developing, but we're not incorporating these sorts of things on our own, right? And so now you're having to go back to places like Hanford Street or Raymond Street that have been developed and try to now put something in place. And I guess for me, it seems a little backwards. We really need to be able to tell folks now, sooner rather than later to do this, because right now South Norwalk is really on a roll with development. And so my fear is that we're going to have all this development done and then go back and say, how do we fix it, or how do we improve it? Which is where we are, because as you know, all that development that's going on right now. Concord Street is an issue that hasn't had any real development, but it does flood. And I noticed the last time that there was a flood, there was significant water that sort of ran down, if that makes sense, to Concord from Raymond, because I think they raised it a little bit. So that water now is increasing in the Concord Street area. But again, that's something, and I think Josh asked the question, you said we would have to raise or lower the street. What did you say about the streets? We'd have to raise it, John?
Yeah, you'd have to elevate it. Yeah, you'd have to
Elevate
elevate it, I think about 4 feet in that, because that's like a particularly low stretch there.
Yes.
So going back to that question about like, how do you do it? And again, we're looking around at other parts of the country that are having the same issue. For instance, Miami Beach, or just, they're just elevating roads like all over the city because they have such a drastic flood problem for many different reasons. So what they call it this idea of harmonizing. So you have all of these sites with driveways and entrances and all of these different things. Part of the challenge is like harmonizing all of the different sites to a new elevation. But there are places that are figuring this out. It's easier to do in places where you have less property to sort of deal with. So places where you have a lot of property already is going to be more challenging. Some of those areas of Woodward, where it's very dense and residential and there's a very small sidewalk, and so elevating those streets is going to be a real challenge. But there are probably other spots like that stretch of Day Street where you have less property. Maybe there's development that's under consideration where you have more control over what goes in there. Those are places that you really want to prioritize. And I agree. You really want to think critically about bringing like a coherence to the resilience aspects of the development in the same way that you want the buildings to be sort of aligning with a certain style or, other kinds of restrictions. You want to think about making sure that each development is kind of maximizing that resilience aspect and not, like I said, making the problem worse for the city.
Right. Right.
So one of the things that I know that planning and zoning is considering to do is have a resiliency day to talk about some of the things they're putting into the code. It sounds like we really need somebody like you to kind of weigh in on that. So expect a phone call.
It's all right. I'm getting them all the time anyways. So
because this sounds really crucial. I promised everybody we were going to have a 6:30 end. It's 6:29. Are there any other last questions or concerns that we ought to bring to John's attention, or should we just thank him for scaring the daylights out of us and getting our attention on this really important issue? Thank you. Thanks for coming, and thanks for revisiting other people's work. I know that you're just one of the team, but you had to carry the whole bucket of water, so to speak, today.
Thank
Great.
you.
All righty. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And
Thanks, Lisa.
we'll suggest it to some of our team to watch the video.
All right, thank you.
Great.
Lisa, do you have to make
Thank you
an
very
official vote on
I guess
adjourning?
somebody better motion to adjourn. Mr. Livingston, all in favor? Otherwise, I guess we wouldn't be out of adjournment.
Right.
Brian, if I don't see you, have a good trip. Bye, guys.
Thank
All right,
you.
take care.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.